In the early 1960s, a quiet American teenager named Frank Abagnale would begin a story that the world would later call one of the most extraordinary fraud cases in modern history. A story that decades later inspired the Hollywood film Catch Me If You Can. According to the legend that made him famous, Abagnale's life began to unravel when his parents divorced, and at just 16 years old he ran away from home with little money and no clear future. But somewhere along the way he discovered something powerful about the systems that govern society. Most institutions run on trust, and most people rarely question authority when it looks convincing enough. His earliest scams reportedly began with forged checks, altering small banking documents and exploiting the slow verification systems of the time, gradually learning how to manipulate routing numbers and bank procedures. As his confidence grew, the schemes allegedly became far more ambitious. Abagnale claimed that he realized airline pilots carried a level of automatic respect that few people would ever challenge. So he acquired a pilot's uniform and began impersonating a crew member for Pan American World Airways. Using a little-known aviation practice called deadheading, which allowed airline personnel to travel on flights without paying, he said he was able to move across the United States and eventually around the world while cashing fraudulent payroll checks in multiple cities. The disguise was simple but effective: a uniform, a confident posture, and the assumption that someone dressed like a pilot must belong in the cockpit crew. According to Abagnale's story, the impersonations didn't stop there. At different points he claimed to have posed as a pediatric doctor supervising interns in a Georgia hospital, allegedly bluffing his way through meetings and hospital routines by relying on the authority of the title rather than actual medical knowledge. In another episode, he described working briefly as a prosecutor in Louisiana, again stepping into a professional role simply by acting as though he belonged there. By the late 1960s, his story suggested that the scheme had expanded across dozens of countries, forging checks worth more than $2 million while evading law enforcement through constant movement and carefully constructed identities. Eventually, the chase caught up with him. Abagnale said he was arrested in France in 1969 after authorities began tracing the pattern of fraudulent checks across Europe, later extradited to the United States where he faced multiple fraud charges and prison sentences. But the story didn't end there. In what became the most famous twist of the legend, Abagnale later claimed that federal agents recognized his unusual expertise in financial deception and offered him an opportunity to cooperate, eventually working with the Federal Bureau of Investigation as a consultant on fraud prevention. Over the following decades, he would reinvent himself as a security expert, advising banks, corporations, and law enforcement agencies on how criminals exploit weaknesses in financial systems, publishing books, giving lectures, and becoming widely known as the former con artist who turned his life around. For many years, the story was accepted almost without question, repeated in interviews, corporate seminars, and media appearances, until investigative journalists and historians began examining the historical record more closely. When reporters started comparing Abagnale's claims with court documents, prison records, and institutional archives, inconsistencies began to appear. Some timelines suggested that during periods when Abagnale said he was traveling the world committing elaborate cons, he may actually have been incarcerated for smaller fraud offenses. Several banks and organizations mentioned in his accounts reported no record of the large-scale check schemes described in his lectures, and certain events portrayed as international adventures appeared difficult to confirm through official documentation. Gradually, a different possibility began to emerge, that the real story of Frank Abagnale may have been far smaller than the legend that followed. If so, the most fascinating part of the case is not simply the fraud itself, but how a compelling narrative can grow over time until it becomes accepted as history. The image of a teenage genius outsmarting airlines, hospitals, and banks fit perfectly into a cultural fascination with clever criminals and redemption stories, making it easy for audiences to embrace the myth. Whether Abagnale truly carried out the globe-spanning schemes he described or whether parts of the legend expanded as his career grew remains a topic of debate among researchers. But in a strange way, the question itself reveals something deeper about human psychology and authority. People often trust confidence, titles, and compelling stories far more than they trust verification. And if that is true, then Frank Abagnale may have understood something about institutions long before anyone began questioning his claims, that sometimes the most powerful deception is not the forged check or the stolen identity, but the story convincing enough that the world never thinks to doubt it.